Tornadoes are one of the most bewildering phenomena that is observed on our planet. Each and every year, over 1,000 tornadoes on average touch down across the planet, with the majority of those occurring in the United States. Just like every other major natural disaster observed on this planet, not all tornadoes are the same, both in terms of structure and, what's relevant to this video, intensity. But unlike the other types of natural disasters such as hurricanes and earthquakes, there's a lot we still don't know about tornadoes that would be essential to accurately estimating their intensities as they're occurring. However, due to how tornadoes vary in strength, a scale was created for the sole purpose of estimating how intense a tornado's wind speeds were when they occurred, based on the damage left behind, beginning with the Fujita Scale in the 1970s, and the scale that is the topic of today's video, the Enhanced Fujita Scale, which was implemented in 2007. These scales estimate the intensity of a tornado based on the damage left behind after the tornado has passed. But out of all weather-based scales, the Enhanced Fujita Scale is the one that is the most controversial, especially over the past few years. The biggest issue, according to those who oppose the scale, is that the scale itself just doesn't work, and that the scale severely underrates the intensity of tornadoes. Now, to be fair, they aren't wrong that the scale is broken. The scale underestimates the intensity of some tornadoes, but to a degree that is not that significant. I'm getting ahead of myself already. But the ways on how to fix the scale itself also have their own problems in their own right. The Enhanced Fujita Scale itself is such a hot topic that I think it warrants its own video on the scale itself. Talking about why it exists in the first place, the issues of the scale, the proposed fixes and how those fixes have their own issues in of itself, whether or not the issues of tornadoes not being rated EF5 really matters, it doesn't. Okay, yet again, I'm getting ahead of myself. Today, I am going to cover everything regarding the scale's issues and how serious of a problem the scale in its current form really is, by looking at the claims of what is happening because of the scale in its current state. Grab yourself a snack and a glass of orange juice because this is going to be a long one. Welcome to Nature's Fury. But first, we need context, and in order to understand how the Enhanced Fujita Scale got to the place that it's in now, we gotta look back at the scale before the Enhanced Fujita Scale, the Fujita Scale. Now, I don't want to bore everyone with history as much as I find it interesting, so I'm going to briefly talk about the history of the Fujita Scale. If you want a detailed overview of the history of the scale and what led up to the scale, there's a PBS documentary on the subject, so go watch that, it's really good. The original Fujita Scale was designed by Dr. Ted Fujita over the course of many years to correlate the damage done by a tornado to an estimated intensity of the tornado after the fact. What this means is that the Fujita Scale, and therefore the Enhanced Fujita Scale, is a damage scale, not a wind scale. That'll be important for later. The scale originally went from F0 to F12 to match the Mach number scale and the Beaufort scale, but looking at how the original scale would work, the scale was shrunk down for obvious reasons to a scale ranging from F0 to F5, with plans of the F6 rating being used, but it was ultimately never used. The scale was made at the time with very little information available on the damage caused by wind, so everything at that point was an educated guess. The scale was formally introduced in 1971 in collaboration with Alan Pearson, who was head of the National Severe Storms Forecast Center, now known as the Storm Prediction Center. It goes with no surprise that the scale was quickly accepted by NOAA as an official scale to rate tornadoes. Of course, the Fujita Scale and the work that Dr. Fujita did to create the scale is extremely important to what we know about tornadoes now. But in 2007, the Fujita Scale was dropped and replaced with a new scale called the Enhanced Fujita Scale. So why was the new scale made? Well, we need to look over the issues that plagued the original Fujita Scale that warranted the scale being updated. So let's dive into that. But first, real quick, the majority of people who like these videos are not subscribed to the channel, so if you enjoy what I create, consider subscribing. It helps the channel and tells me I'm doing something right. Also, just for this video, YouTube memberships opened up, so if you want to get access to my scripts and full interviews, consider joining it. It supports me financially. I swear, this is the only time I'll mention any membership thing mid-video. Anyways, back to the Fujita Scale. A lot of videos that I've seen on this topic tend to leave out what led the Enhanced Fujita Scale to be created in the first place, and while I understand why, I do think that the context as to why the Enhanced Fujita Scale had to be made is very important to the issues that surround it. When it comes to the original Fujita scale, there were two major issues when it came to accurately rating tornadoes. Two issues doesn't sound like a lot, but it comes down to what those issues were. So let's go over this. Problem 1. The wind speed estimates were too high. One of the main issues that was noticed very early on was the wind speed estimates themselves. While the lower end estimates for tornado intensity, specifically the wind speeds for an F0 and F1 tornado, are relatively the same as the wind speeds for an EF0 and EF1, things got weirder from there on. What was noticed early on was that the higher the scale went, the more chaotic the wind speed estimates got. An F4 tornado started at 207 miles per hour, while an F5 tornado started at 261. So what's the issue? The issue is that tornadoes are being rated with a scale that had questionable wind speeds assigned to them at the higher end of the scale. Knowing what we know now, it's rare for tornadoes to even have winds higher than 200 miles per hour, so the F-scale's wind speed estimates needed to be tweaked in order to become more consistent. But in a similar vein, the issue of overrating a tornado's true intensity was also due to the fact that the original Fujita scale did not take into account construction quality of structures. Problem 2. Construction quality. So here's a short hypothetical. Imagine you have two houses side by side, one that is poorly constructed with nothing holding it to its foundation, and right next to it a solidly constructed house with anchoring to its foundation through the use of anchor bolts. Let's say a hypothetical tornado with winds of 140 miles per hour goes through these two houses. Of course, we don't know the strength of the tornado, but I'm just giving a short hypothetical. The poorly constructed house gets slabbed while the house besides it that was properly anchored is mostly destroyed but still has some interior and outside walls left while being attached to its foundation. Now, under the original Fujita scale, they'd look at the slabbed house and likely rate it an F4 or F5, then look at the well-constructed house and give it an F2 or F3 rating. Because the Fujita scale is a damage scale, the final rating of a tornado is dependent on the damage it causes. Do you see an issue with the hypothetical that I just mentioned? Now, in practice, it is not that extreme of a discrepancy, but you get what I'm trying to say here. A structure's construction quality was not taken into account when rating a tornado. Of course, this would end up being an issue for the tornado database, but also in a way this negatively affected building codes. I'm gonna go out on a limb and say that designing a house that can withstand an F3 tornado, given that F3 tornadoes have winds starting out at 160 miles per hour, is difficult as it is. And anything above that, construction workers would practically have no reason to build houses that could withstand F4 tornadoes and above, and just call them acts of God and move on. There were also various other issues that the original Fujita scale had that resulted from these two major issues. The entire system of rating tornado damage was completely subjective, the scale was difficult to apply to tornadoes that didn't hit anything, and it was subject to bias. The two issues that I just mentioned, the wind speed estimates being too high and the issues surrounding the construction quality of structures, were well known before the new scale was even proposed. The first report that looked into the Fujita scale and the potential issues with the scale came out in 1977, so the issues were known at this point, but actually proposing an updated scale was, to my knowledge, not really a logical step forward. Dr. Fujita was still alive, and in fact, he made an attempt to fix the scale's issues, but to no avail. The issues surrounding the Fujita scale still persisted. But what drove the movement to upgrade the Fujita scale? Well, two tornadoes in particular. The first one was the 1997 Gerald F5 tornado. Yes, I've already made a video on this, and I'm pretty much rehashing what I said there, but let me just give a brief overview of what happened there. A year after the tornado occurred, a NIST report written by Dr. Longfon and Emil Simu claimed that the houses that were destroyed by the Gerald tornado were poorly constructed, and that the minimum wind speeds needed to do the level of destruction seen in the Double Creek Estates neighborhood would be that of an F3 tornado at the least. Dr. Fon did not claim that the tornado itself was not an F5 tornado, but noted that the wind speeds that would be needed to destroy the houses would be that of an F3 tornado. Again, it was very likely that the tornado had winds in excess of 260 miles per hour. I don't think anyone in the report, or anyone at NIST, would say otherwise. Dr. Fon confirmed that to me whenever I talked to him back in May. According to Dr. Fon, the NWS did their job properly and gave the tornado the proper rating it deserved. The issue is that the scale itself was broken.
The problem is this. It was rated an F5 based on the observed damage in accordance with the F scale at the time by the National Weather Service. And we and the National Weather Service don't see things differently at all. Their job is they're tasked with rating tornado. So they have the tool they use is the Fujita scale. And based on the damage classification, the description of damage that they have, it clearly to them an F5. Um, and it's not their opinion. They are doing their job using the tool that available to them. The problem with that is the tool is flawed. So that we point out, if you look at this damage description, we cannot tell the difference in terms of wind speed based on the quality of the construction. You might come up with an overclassification. An overclassification of tornado corrupt the tornado database, which eventually lead to the design criteria that is so substantially higher than actuality, that caused everyone to throw their hand up and say, we cannot design for tornado. It's too strong. And that would become an excuse for builder, designer, constructor to continue to build weak structure that keep getting damaged due to wind speed that we think could be designed for. The reason what we saw in Jaro and conclude that is doesn't need to take an F5 to call this kind of damage that we observe. Because what you pointed out, the connection between the sill plate from the between the upper structure and the foundation was not by anchor bolt. It was pneumatically driven nails, right? Which by engineering calculation, it wouldn't take the wind speed that associated with an F5 tornado to cause the damage. In our calculation, the wind speed of an F3 tornado would overcome 3 times the safety factor of those that kind of structure that were in Jaro. Therefore, what we said was we don't need to explain that an F5 caused the damage that observed. The wind speed that associated with an F3 tornado could easily cause the same damage that we observed. We don't have the measurement. We're just saying that by looking at these damage, it's not necessary to conclude it an F5. It can easily be done by an F3. That's what we are saying by engineering calculation.
The next tornado was the 1999 Bridge Creek Moore F5 tornado, which had measured winds of 301 miles per hour with a margin of error of 18 miles per hour on Doppler radar. The extreme wind speeds recorded of the tornado were valid. However, the issue came down to the varying construction quality for most of the locations that were hit by the Moore F5 tornado, with a report from FEMA stating that engineers found houses were constructed to withstand winds correlating with an F2 tornado. That doesn't mean that there weren't any well-built homes. In fact, there were plenty, but the majority of them were not built very well. So, over the next few years, a team of engineers and meteorologists came together at Texas Tech University to develop a new scale that would be used to assess tornado damage. That scale was the Enhanced Fujita Scale. The Enhanced Fujita Scale was created in cooperation with a number of notable meteorologists and engineers to create a scale that would more accurately correlate the minimum winds needed to create the damage caused by a tornado. In a sense, the scale itself works the exact same way in principle as the original Fujita Scale. Tornado happens, surveyors go out to look at the damage and see and estimate the minimum winds needed to create the level of destruction for said area. But there were two major changes that made the scale very different. For one, the actual wind speeds that correlated with each category of the scale were toned down a lot on the higher end of the spectrum. EF3 started at 140 miles per hour and ended at 165 instead of it going from like 150 to 200. That was streamlined to be more realistic, and it was. This part of the scale, nobody has any issue with. Rather, it was the second part of the scale people have problems with. The Enhanced Fujita Scale, unlike its predecessor, now had these nifty things called damage indicators. The very dumbed down version of how it works now is that each damage indicator has an attached series of degrees of damage, or DODs. The DODs estimate the expected lower and upper bound wind speed from the specific damage indicator that it's attached to. When it comes to human-built structures, the upper and lower bounds that are recorded are directly related to the construction quality of the structure. Basically, the new damage indicators were put in place as a form of taking into account construction quality of structures to prevent tornadoes from being overrated. And when the scale came out, there was a lot of praise for the new scale, and it worked well throughout its early life, from 2007 through 2011. But the issues with the scale were pretty much apparent with the most infamous single tornado from 2011, Joplin. Out of all of the major tornadoes, Joplin was the one that brought attention to the flaws of the current scale that we use today. Even though the tornado did get an EF5 rating, a report from NIST written by Dr. Fott explains that Joplin's EF5 rating did not come from an official damage indicator. And then another report from the American Society of Civil Engineers, or the ASCE for short, stated in 2013 that no EF5 damage indicators were found in Joplin. The National Weather Service said that it wasn't surprised and that it was difficult for Joplin to get the EF5 rating in the first place. The hard math done to get the estimates needed to get the Joplin tornado rated EF5 was justified, and it proves that the EF5 rating is accurate. But the major point that both of these reports make is that Joplin's journey to get the EF5 rating leads to the conclusion that there needs to be more damage indicators to properly rate tornadoes on the Enhanced Fujita Scale. To put it one way, one of the more likely reasons as to why we don't use contextual evidence for tornado ratings anymore is because of Joplin. And Joplin got the EF5 rating at the end of the day anyway. So we've known the problem since 2011, which begs the question, why isn't the update to the scale out yet? Well, there's a lot to discuss regarding the situation regarding the Enhanced Fujita Scale and its update process, and I'm gonna try and make this as painless as possible. Basically, there wasn't much of an original problem with the original Fujita Scale because it was owned by Dr. Fujita, and by the time the EF scale was made, he was dead. So, making a new scale could be done by anyone since the NWS just adopted it and the Enhanced Fujita Scale was seen as a new thing. However, when it comes to updating the Enhanced Fujita Scale after the fact, the big question was who was in charge of updating it. The Enhanced Fujita Scale was made in collaboration between meteorologists and engineers at Texas Tech University. By all accounts, Texas Tech owns the scale, but they don't use it. The Enhanced Fujita Scale is administered by the National Weather Service, but because engineers are involved, maybe NIST or the ASC, you see where I'm going with this. Basically, it was one massive who's in charge of updating the scale issue for a few years. According to Tim Marshall, a select committee of members from the American Meteorological Society and ASCE was chosen to evaluate the state of the Enhanced Fujita Scale and how to update the scale to be better. But images of meetings of the committee have been making the rounds on Twitter and have gained more relevance now more than ever. So before I address the people who over-exaggerate the issues of the Enhanced Fujita Scale, what steps are being taken to update the scale? Well, let's talk about it, and how would it change the scale as we know it now? Change number 1, more damage indicators. I'm not going to go over the entire list, but the main goal of the added damage indicators is to make it more specific and get rid of anything that could confuse damage surveyors when identifying what damage indicator was what. The scale is being standardized, and is being updated to give more accurate results regarding the potential strength of tornadoes after the fact, and it's being made to be easier to use. That's the confirmed bits and pieces of what's expected to change with the new Enhanced Fujita Scale. But there are also certain proposals that the committee is looking into, or others outside the committee have suggested, that have their own problems in their own right. What I'm getting at is that the proposals in question are more complicated to implement than it's given credit for, and it's also likely why it's taking so long for the new update to come out. The first of which is ground scouring as a damage indicator. If you are on Twitter at all, you might have heard a bunch of people rambling about how ground scouring needs to be added as a damage indicator, and imply that the process of ground scouring is simple enough to make an estimate of tornado intensity after the fact. The problem is that ground scouring is one of the biggest mystery-esque effects from tornadoes that we truly don't understand, and is heavily influenced on the context of where the tornado occurred. If there was a single tornado to blame for the whole ground scouring debate, it was the Philadelphia EF5 from the super outbreak, which caused ground scouring with a depth of 2 feet to the ground, which was mostly clay. But what is ground scouring? Well, To put it as basically as possible to the best of my understanding, when referring to tornadoes, it's the aftermath of extreme wind erosion caused by wind. At least that's what I think it means in the context of tornadoes. I say I think because that's just a guess because there isn't a standard definition on it when it comes to tornadoes. If you Google it, you get ground scouring based on water and hydrologic processes instead of wind. The biggest issue with ground scouring is that there's so little research on it. We know what ground scouring is when it comes to tornadoes, it's just we don't have a basic definition for it other than, well, it's whenever there's a big hole in the ground because of a tornado. Not really a great definition. As a phenomenon regarding tornadoes, there's so much we don't know about the inner workings of a tornado and its effects on the landscape that we just don't have the capabilities of figuring out yet. In order for something to be a damage indicator, there needs to be some sort of associated wind speed associated with it, but we don't know if there's a ratio between specific wind speeds and how deep ground scouring is. Not to mention that it heavily depends on the soil composition itself. Soil types such as sand and silt erode and move at a much faster rate than clay, for example. So then it depends on the soil composition, which then brings in geologists into the equation, and you see how many issues there are when it comes to implementing ground scouring as a damage indicator? There are so many if and but statements that would have to be made for ground scouring to be implemented as a damage indicator, and that's given we understand the process itself, which, as of right now, we don't. If the scale itself and the way it's used is supposed to be standardized, implementing something like ground scouring goes against that whole principle because of how complex it is. The other proposal would completely change the status of the Enhanced Fujita Scale as a damage scale. So, when it comes to radar imagery, this is something that people have been advocating for a while now. So let's talk about it. When it comes to using NEXRAD radars, that is going to be considered going forward, although there's some issues to work out. Unless the storm is really close to the radar site, it's pretty much impossible to determine the wind speeds of a tornado, especially because radar beams are looking up into the atmosphere, not the surface. Again, this is just based on velocity readings. We can get a good estimate, but looking at NEXRAD velocity readings is not very useful. If we are just using velocity on its own, that is. TDS heights is a useful parameter that can determine whether or not a tornado is likely violent while it's ongoing, and I think that's the best bet we got right now. Also, just so I mention it real quick, I am aware of the tornado intensity guidance sheet that uses NEXRAD radar readings to determine a potential intensity probability as the tornado is ongoing. While I think that this is something that could work, I also know that this sheet is nowhere near official, and the sheet says that as such. Sam Emerson is a graduate student from what I know, so he clearly knows his stuff. I have no reason to doubt him or his work. I think that this intensity sheet could work regarding NEXRAD data in the future, but again, this is so new that I haven't really looked into it that much, and in regards to how successful it is in regards to final rating versus what it shows, we don't know because it's just so new. Another tool is Doppler on wheels, or DOWs for short, and I see and agree with using DOWs going forward as well. There was this paper that was making the rounds because of a video high-risk Chris made on the EF scale back in December titled, "Supercell tornadoes are much stronger and wider than damage-based ratings indicate." So I read through the paper and it's essentially a nothing burger. Okay, I'm getting ahead of myself. Basically, the article itself points out that wind measurement from DOWs are 1 to 2 categories higher than the NWS official rating on average. If I can tell you as to why that is likely the case, it's probably because the Enhanced Fujita Scale is a damage scale and is treated as such. It doesn't take a genius to figure out that supercell tornadoes that are in the plains that don't hit anything are likely stronger than they are officially rated. Now, does the report argue for incorporating something to the EF scale or argue that the scale needs to be reworked? No, because that wasn't the point of the study. The point of the study was to determine the discrepancies between tornado intensities based on data recording from DOWs and the damage surveys of the NWS. Also, just for funsies, the data set that was used for this study was before the EF scale was even implemented, and the report consistently refers to these tornado ratings as EF ratings instead of F ratings. May not seem like a big deal at all, but considering that we are talking about the ratings of tornadoes using the old scale, I don't see why the paper is used to advocate for how bad the EF scale is. In fact, I don't get why this paper is used at all other than the buzz about how DOWs measure stronger winds than ratings estimated by the NWS, which we already know that. Of course, the infamous tornado that is the reason as to why people are requesting Dow data to be used in the Enhanced Fujita Scale is the 2013 El Reno EF3. The tornado was initially rated as an EF5, but then downgraded to EF3 because while Dow measured winds of 295 miles per hour, the tornado didn't hit anything that would suggest an EF5 rating. The Dow data is nice and all, but the Enhanced Fujita Scale is a damage scale at the end of the day, and that's why El Reno was downgraded. Out of all of the tornadoes that had a controversial rating, this is the tornado that people point to, and I understand and agree to a certain extent. The tornado was rated as an EF3 and has listed winds of 295 miles per hour, which is weird, and I do think that El Reno likely had winds correlating with an EF5 tornado. El Reno 2013 would definitely get a better rating if we included Dow data as another piece of the equation when it comes to rating tornadoes. But I also feel like that focusing on El Reno 2013's rating is also missing the bigger picture of what El Reno's legacy is. That being, it's the deadliest disaster in storm chasing history. We lost people that day who were not only doing major research projects at the time to help better understand tornadoes, but people lost friends and family that day. Out of all the tornadoes that are listed on Wikipedia as being a possible F5 or EF5, which, side note, I will not be talking about those other tornadoes in depth because I don't want this to be like 5 years long, El Reno 2013 is only one of 3 tornadoes that has Dow data. If the Dow wasn't there, I seriously doubt that we would be having this conversation about El Reno 2013. I could go deeper into this and El Reno 2013 specifically, but I got a video planned for that and I'll save it for that. Not to mention that we cannot have Dows everywhere. Using Dows as a supplement is a good idea, and I think that's what's likely to happen. However, the issue is now we are changing the scale from a damage scale to a hybrid scale, and that is a process that I don't even want to begin to debate about how it would even be implemented. If I had to guess as to why the update is taking so long, this may be one of the big reasons as to why. Hey, so this is a midway editing note. By the time that I am recording this bit, 40 minutes of the video has been edited. So why am I doing this? Well, it's something that I wouldn't say I got wrong, but something I kind of didn't know about because I literally couldn't find it. Which is about, there was a video posted by, I believe it was, the committee last year about what's taking them so long, what's going on in the process, that I couldn't find until, I believe it's Understimulant on Discord, pointed it out to me. The main reason why it's taking forever is yay bureaucracy, which is the most fun thing to deal with whenever we're talking about weather stuff. That's the primary reason. It's just this long, convoluted process that here's a screenshot of the exact process as a whole. The whole thing is 2 hours long, so I'm not going over all of that here, but the TLDR is that bureaucracy is the main primary reason as to why it's taking so long. I do think that, yes, them talking about DIs, and yes, the issue of making the scale a hybrid scale is, or does play a part in why it's taking so long. It's just, it's not the main reason. So, yeah, I hope that explains everything. Yet again, I'm sorry for interrupting in the middle of the video, but I desperately needed to mention this. I understand that implementing wind measurements from Dows is a great idea and should be implemented, but the EF scale's status as a damage scale is the big problem that needs to be worked around. Other proposals are going on, but those are the 2 big ones that I would see there being potential issues in putting into the scale right now. I do want to say that the process of using contextual evidence to reach a final rating of a tornado is fine, and I think it should be something that should be taken into account when the update to the Enhanced Fujita Scale comes out. I'd be fine with it. In fact, I think it would be fantastic. But again, that would be tricky when the EF scale is trying to be standardized, so I understand why it's an avenue that may not be taken when the update comes out. I'm not up in arms about how bad the EF scale is because the select committee is working on a fix, and they are taking their time. I don't want them to rush this, because then that would lead to more fixes that would take even longer to do. Science takes a long time, and especially for when it comes to something like the rating scale for tornadoes. So, now we get to the fun part. The part where I debunk how terrible the scale is in its current state according to some. Alright, I will try my best to keep this semi-professional, but I'm gonna be honest here. The real lesson of this video is that the Enhanced Fujita Scale is not as atrocious and an existential threat to tornado science as some make it out to be. It has its problems, don't get me wrong, but let me be clear that if the Enhanced Fujita Scale wasn't put into place, we'd be having a much worse problem regarding the tornado database right now. Some people say that the state of the scale is corrupting the tornado database, which makes the situation seem worse than it actually is. I'm gonna go on a limb here and argue that the majority of EF4 tornadoes could be rated as F5 if the old Fujita scale wasn't updated. So yes, because one house was slapped in Noonan, Noonan could be rated an F5 with the old scale. I'm mainly going to be going over the big issues I have seen regarding how big of a deal the scale is in its current state, because TLDR, the worst problem with the scale is a completely separate issue that has been exposed as of late. I already mentioned the tornado database point, but I want to talk about the reasons as to why people talk about some tornadoes being misrated. I feel like some, if not an uncomfortably large portion of it, is for clout. I think the rest are people who want to learn and don't have any serious resources to go to about the inner workings of the scale without being bombarded by meteorological jargon. But for some, I feel like there's some attention-seeking involved there. There are a few people who make long-winded Twitter threads or full-on YouTube videos about how tornadoes are misrated, and when I ask for serious evidence, serious enough for me to doubt the work done by certified meteorologists and engineers with bachelor's or even PhDs in their field, I get nothing. I get people showing images of slapped homes and how the tornado was a textbook EF5 based on images with no further scientific reasoning. I want to say, first of all, that videos or threads structured in the way that I described is implying that a tornado's legacy is mainly defined by slapped homes and a stupid number attached to it. I hate to be that guy, but I feel like going on and on about how tornadoes weren't rated EF5 because of how a house was slapped is quite insensitive to those who have actually survived storms that robbed them of everything they have. Just so you know, that entire statement is why I had to rewrite this part of the script. A tornado's legacy is more than its rating. I don't understand why that's hard to understand, but so many people are putting more emphasis on a tornado's rating, which just confuses me. Isn't the main reason why the National Weather Service and meteorologists do their job is to help prevent the loss of life and property? If tornadoes being misrated was such a problem, then there should be meteorologists coming out pointing it out, but they're not. Because it's pointless and childish to try and simplify a tornado's legacy by a number next to its name. It's only because some people are arguing in real time about how the tornado was gonna be an EF4 tornado while it's happening, with no degree and having no idea what they're talking about. Typically, the reasoning as to why tornadoes don't get those ratings is because there are elements in the ground that we don't see that the damage surveyors are seeing. Elements that you need to be on the ground for in order to understand. You could say a building was well constructed based on the photos you see online, but if the evidence saying that it was EF5 boils down to look at the damage, I'm sorry, I'm not going to take you seriously. I want to see the hard evidence. Either it be hard math like what happened with the Joplin tornado, or Dow measurements to even begin to take you seriously and start doubting the work of engineers and meteorologists. But again, this is assuming that the National Weather Service is intentionally misrating tornadoes, which I seriously doubt they are. Their job is to use the scale as it was intended. They are using it as it was intended. It's not an issue of the National Weather Service, it's the issue of the scale itself. A lot of talk about what tornadoes should be rated EF5 feel like they are made for the sake of clicks and clout. Hence, why I don't see any degreed meteorologists making long-winded Twitter threads about how Mayfield was an EF5 for the cajillionth time. So, with that issue taken care of, let's talk about the next point. Some are arguing that the scale as it stands right now is negatively affecting how people react and prepare for tornadic events, and saying that if the scale was updated, it would improve tornado preparedness. So the issue of people not taking tornadoes seriously. This is gonna sound dumb at first, but the big issue regarding this claim is tornadoes aren't hurricanes? What do I mean by this? Hurricanes are rated in real time with the help of satellite imagery and recon flights. This is possible because hurricanes are long-lasting systems lasting for as long as multiple weeks, And when it comes to flying into one, it is humanly possible. Hurricane categories are used as an aid for messaging the seriousness of hurricanes whenever they're about to make landfall. On the other hand, tornadoes cannot be rated in real time, at least not as of right now. They dissipate too quickly for us to do anything in real time most of the time, and due to how extreme the conditions are with how tornadoes loft debris into the air, flying anything into them is borderline insanity. So with that in mind, what does tornado preparedness have anything to do with tornadoes being slightly underrated by the Enhanced Fujita Scale? I'd argue that your average American isn't going to look at a tornado and say, well, if that isn't an EF4, I'm not going to go underground, as it's barreling straight for them. I'm sorry, but as someone who lived in a rural community for about, let's say, 18 years, a rural community that barely sees tornadoes, when a warning gets issued, everyone starts panicking about the worst case scenario to begin with anyway. The issue of tornado preparedness and how seriously people take tornado messaging is not the point of the Enhanced Fujita Scale. Never was and never will be. If they're trying to argue that the EF scale in its current state is damaging messaging, well, I don't exactly see any specific points as to how it's harming messaging. So I'm just inferring to it being taken literally in this scenario because nobody wants to elaborate on that point. There is a serious issue regarding people not taking tornadoes seriously or just extreme weather in general seriously, but that's an area of study that is fit for social scientists. You know, people who study psychology and all that jazz, not people who study the atmosphere. There could be a collaboration, but the big problem with using tornado awareness is that a lot of these claims of how the EF scale's problems are leading to people not taking it seriously isn't claimed by social scientists. It's by weather weenies. There's some overlap between what meteorologists and social scientists say on the topic, but a serious look by social scientists should take priority over what meteorologists say. If you want people to take tornadoes seriously, then meteorologists need to take strides in making better forecasts and making them easy to understand for your average American citizen. But it's also on the citizens to take it seriously for themselves. There is personal responsibility in this problem. The weather enterprise isn't just the National Weather Service. A lot of the burden regarding messaging also relies on broadcast meteorologists. And arguing that something that is assigned after the fact is fundamental towards messaging before an event even happens is just nonsensical. But the biggest claim that I see is the issue regarding how the EF scale in its current state is negatively affecting building codes by not being updated, when in reality, the building codes in their current state is the biggest issue regarding tornado ratings. I know that sounds weird, but I couldn't think of a better way to phrase it. What do I mean by this? There's this trend that I've noticed across the majority of tornadoes that have either gotten their tornado ratings downgraded or was on the cusp of getting rated EF5. That being, there were issues regarding the construction of structures hit by the tornado. Homes weren't anchored properly or anchored at all. Homes or structures were not properly constructed, or there were shortcuts being made in construction to save a few bucks. Construction shortcuts, I believe, may be a bigger issue than people give credit for when it comes to the EF scale. A lot of tornadoes, Western Kentucky and Tuscaloosa specifically, were extremely close to getting rated EF5. But the structures ended up being poorly constructed, or there was evidence that shortcuts were taken during construction. I say shortcuts were used simply because I don't see any other reason why companies or people would want to do a shoddy job at anchoring a property otherwise than to just get it done faster. Not to mention, these newer building codes do not affect structures that were built before the codes were introduced, which, fun fact, most structures in the United States are quite old, especially in the Deep South. When I'm referring to older structures, please keep in mind that I'm mainly referring to structures built before 1980. A vast majority of the buildings in the Deep South are very old, dating back to sometime in the mid-1900s, with some houses being around for even longer. But even with newer structures built in the 1980s and onward, studies claim that engineers aren't designing some structures with higher-end tornadoes in mind, due to a lack of wind load data that needs to be collected after a tornado has occurred to actually construct buildings that would withstand extreme wind speeds from tornadoes. The issue with the lack of wind load data, again, comes from the fact that the wind speed estimates used in both the Fujita Scale and the Enhanced Fujita Scale are educated guesses because we have no other choice in the matter. Even with the technology we have today, we can get close to figuring out what wind speeds could destroy what homes, but we have to rely on tornadoes actually happening and hitting those structures to get the data correct, assuming that the data is collected before cleanup efforts go underway. It's a combination of some structures, especially before the Enhanced Fujita Scale, having construction shortcuts being done during construction, and the fact that constructing houses for higher-end tornadoes, at least in some locations, is considered to be not worth the effort because the wind load data is that hard to come by. What I'm getting at here is that the issue of construction quality itself and building codes isn't an issue that is inherently with the Enhanced Fujita Scale itself. The issue of inconsistent construction quality affects the accurate rating of tornadoes with the Enhanced Fujita Scale, and if we had better constructed buildings, the scale itself would be pretty close to perfect. But the source of the lack of well-built structures in portions of the United States comes from the fact that United States infrastructure, to put it lightly, sucks. That's a whole different topic for an entirely different kind of video, but the bigger issue comes down to the issue of infrastructure quality and funding, and I'm not going to get into that here. Our infrastructure is not commonly built to withstand significant tornadoes, and it just sucks that the only real reliable way of rating tornadoes, at least as of right now, is by using our infrastructure because we don't have any other choice. It's a catch-22 is what I'm getting at. This is an issue that is, I believe, independent of the EF scale as a whole, and its solution is more complex than one would think. The ones in charge of the majority of building codes and the enforcement of said codes are done at the municipal level, not the federal level. The Enhanced Fujita Scale itself went in with the building codes of the plains, an area that often gets strong tornadoes, in mind. Those aren't everywhere, because the climates of each specific area of the United States is different from one another. The issue of improving building codes relies on the local government caring, and I don't see that happening anytime soon, being honest here. Reason? Politics. I'm not going further than that. And in fact, studies are showing that despite the recent severity of tornado events, building codes in public places have not been updated to reflect the increasing severity of tornado events across areas of the United States. Human loss of life is the biggest motivator to get things done, not a damage rating. That isn't me being a narcissist. That's me being around for 20 years and knowing what gets people riled up. Communities, specifically in Dixie Alley, really need to take a hard look at their building codes, not with the motivation of getting a higher rating for a tornado that hits their community, but with the motivation of the safety of its citizens. That's what matters far more here. The Enhanced Fujita Scale likely isn't going to be the big motivator in order to make communities improve their building codes. It's likely going to be to keep their communities safer. At least, that's what I hope. What about the issues of receiving FEMA assistance and insurance claims? Well, let's ignore the fact that FEMA in its current state is a complete mess. I cannot find a report saying that FEMA payout relies on the rating of damage received by a home. I would think it would deal with more of the monetary damages to the house rather than the tornado's strength. With insurance companies, I couldn't find anything. I'd assume that it could have an influence, but I cannot say definitively for sure. The big takeaway from this rant, the last part, is that the big issues regarding the Enhanced Fujita Scale don't logically have a major impact on messaging and tornado preparedness, at least regarding ahead of a tornadic event. The worst thing that results from the Enhanced Fujita Scale in its current state is tornadoes being rated one tornado rating under than what it could have been, and weather nerds frothing at the mouths over, and I really hate to say it, what seems like nerds frothing at the mouths over mostly pointless nerd stuff for attention. That isn't all of them. High Risk Chris isn't one of those since I mentioned him already, but it's definitely a portion of the weather community that I don't understand, nor do I want to begin to understand. Corrupting the tornado database, while technically true, is implying something far worse than what's actually going on. I also want to mention that every time a discussion occurs on the state of the scale itself, people neglect to mention that everything they are ranting about is being added or being addressed with the new update. I could go on and on about this subject and how angry it makes me feel, but I think that's everything that I need to cover regarding this subject, so let's wrap this one up. Plus, I'm pretty sure you're out of popcorn by this point. The Enhanced Fujita Scale is outdated. There's no question about that, and there isn't even any reason to deny it at this point. There are shortcomings of the scale that the professional meteorological community has known about for far longer than the younger generations that are interested in weather have. The first major tornado that exposed the issues with the Enhanced Fujita Scale got the EF5 rating at the end of the day anyway. Thankfully, the select committee of members of the AMS and ASCE are working on fixes to the scale. But I don't think the solution to make it happen faster is to bicker on Twitter like children and make long-winded YouTube videos about how X tornado was misrated. I know I didn't go in depth about any specific tornado about whether or not they could have been rated EF5 besides a Reno 2013, and the belief I hold is that a lot of these tornadoes likely had wind speeds correlating with an EF5 tornado, but the scale is a damage scale at the end of the day, at least for right now. A lot of the people who are part of the problem, and some of those who watch what I do, are not doing this maliciously with the intent to cause drama and get attention. They are people who want to learn about tornadoes, looking for those in higher power with social influence to teach them about it. It just happens that those people don't talk about the issues with the Enhanced Fujita Scale in an in-depth manner and how serious the problems of the scale really are. The big controversies of the Enhanced Fujita Scale really haven't been as significant until a recent boom in the weather community with the Western Kentucky tornado. Again, I'm not a degreed meteorologist. Well, not yet, I'm in college for it. But after being around for 20 years and researching severe weather events and the aftermath of those events for over half a year as my job, I don't have a reason to seriously doubt the officials. Yelling and pitching a fit over a tornado's rating does nothing but make meteorologists want to cry, and for offices to take note of what you are posting on social media for whenever you want to apply for a job. That's not me talking, that's someone from the Storm Prediction Center talking. There are issues with the scale, no doubt, but I feel like those issues and the implications of those issues are being overblown, and that has been the case for the past few months. But I think now that I gave a brief recap of everything I said in this video that is way too long by this point, I think it's time to answer a question that has been proposed time and time again. Does a tornado's final rating, accurate or inaccurate, really matter at the end of the day?
The answer is yes and no.
I say yes in context to the scientific community. Accurately rating anything on a scale when it comes to science has some importance in that field of study. I can't deny that, and especially here, when my major is atmospheric science and meteorology. But accurately rating tornadoes is really hard to do when the subject in question is something that destroys everything in its path, in a field where our best bets of rating said subject are very limited, at least as of right now. The weight of importance that tornado readings have to the scientific community, I believe, is significantly outweighed by the human impacts, which is where the no part of my answer comes from. The most important part of a tornado's legacy, and the part that is remembered by myself, by those affected, and by those from the outside looking in, is the human impact. People who had everything taken away from them. They don't care about a number next to a tornado's name. They are now dealing with multiple issues, from everything being taken away from them to mental health issues. When I look at episodes of storm stories or made-for-TV documentaries by local news stations, the biggest focus on those programs is what happened to the people affected. Interviews with storm survivors are everywhere on those pieces of media. To your average American, a tornado is often remembered by what it did in the towns that were leveled, not whether or not the town that was leveled was by an EF5 or not. I often look at the 2011 super outbreak as an example of a commonly remembered tornado that wasn't EF5. The Tuscaloosa Birmingham EF4 tornado is the most well-known tornado from that event to your average American, and it wasn't the strongest of that outbreak. It was well known because of what it did to the people across its path. A tornado's rating is only a small part of that tornado's legacy. I don't dwell over a tornado's rating in my videos with the exception of the December 10th rant because otherwise I was going to get a gajillion comments about it. Because the true legacy these tornadoes have is with the people who survived and perished. The people who lost everything. And the people who came to help out communities that were in utter shock and suffering. Whether or not a tornado ends up in a textbook doesn't matter to those people and to the general public. And in all honesty, it should truly not matter as much to weather enthusiasts as people make it out to be. There's a serious human element to these disasters that is just as important, if not more important than the rating of the tornado in question. I don't see this as an issue when people talk about hurricanes and how they're misrated. Then again, explaining that point would take forever. You know what, I'll save that explanation about hurricanes when I rant about the Saffir-Simpson scale at some point. It's a debate that I am open to discussing, but at the same time, considering where we are with technology as it stands, the process of rating damage and correlating said damage to the potential wind speeds of a tornado is the best we have right now. That committee is working on fixes, and I implore people to focus on the human impact immediately after, rather than if the tornado was going to be rated as an EF5. That's what I hope some people take away from this. But knowing social media, I have this feeling that I did nothing but enrage both sides because having an open mind is virtually impossible. So the video schedule is going on as planned. This is more of an experimental video considering it's a full-on rant and I haven't done one of these in a long time. Last time I did a full rant was when I did Geometry Dash content, so this is fun. I'll be talking about my first winter storm next time around with the 2021 Texas Deep Freeze. I will not be talking about them by their Weather Channel names because I like to keep my dignity. Besides that, refer to the schedule that is on my Twitter page. Special thanks to my proofreaders, those being Rishi, Allison, JD, Celtic White for the stills that I use, and everyone else for the support lately. It means a lot. Special thanks to those who are subscribed to the channel Patreon or are a YouTube member. Those being Ace Cooper, Maxwell Looney, Montpelier, Tennille's Weather Space Station, and Tanner Lepper at the Alfie's Army tier, and Basilius of Stupidonia, J. Cario, King Shisha, Neon Binary, Origin, Talkboy, and Worm Off the String at the Alf Mini tier. If you want to have access to full uncut interviews and my scripts alongside other things in the future, consider subscribing to the Patreon or joining and becoming a YouTube member. That sums up everything here. Sorry about destroying your eardrums if I have done that this time around, but remember to like, comment, subscribe, share the video around, all that jazz. You all stay safe out there, and I will talk to you all soon.